And we're live. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Thank you so much
Hi,
for joining
Cecil.
us. Hey, what's going on, Ryan?
Not much. What's going on with you? Just kind of excited to be on the show today.
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm excited about it too. I'm a big fan of Dapper, and folks that follow me on Twitter and social media know I've been poking around with like this whole microservice thing for a little bit. So I'm really excited for us to kind of dive into the conversation and learn about how we could use Dapper and build microservices using .NET.
Cool. Awesome. Well, hope we deliver.
Why don't you, before we get started and dive into things, why don't you like tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at Microsoft?
Sure. So my name's Ryan Nowak. I've been at Microsoft for a super long time now. I'm super old. I've been here like 12 years. It feels like a long time. I used to work on .NET, or I guess I still kind of work on .NET, but I used to be part of the .NET team. So if you use Razor Pages, if you use Blazor, if you use Razor, if you use MVC, basically any of the user-facing frameworks in .NET Core, I've kind of had my hands all over those things, as well as .NET Tai, which is a pretty cool project that we're going to see a little of today. I made a transition about maybe 10 months ago to move to Azure, and specifically in the Azure CTO's office, where I work on various experiments and incubation kinds of projects, Dapr being one of those. But I've been involved with Dapr now for a couple of years as a cool, promising project in the cloud native space. And I really dug in there because I looked at Dapr and said, this is something I want .NET to have a really good experience for. And so I've kind of seen this through over the course of the project. Now part of the team that mostly works on Dapr, but it's been a long journey for me. And we finally got to 1.0, which I'm really excited about. So cool to see things come together over time.
Nice. And then 1.0 was just last week, right? So we're not even talking
it was just
about
last week.
Time ago.
Yeah, it was just last week. So we've been building towards 1.0, and now I've gotten to the point where it's a stable production ready feature set. Right. And we promise not to break too much stuff.
Nice. I'm sure everybody appreciates that.
Yeah.
So before we really start diving into Dapr and talking about like, all the .NET integrations and stuff, I do have some links that I want to share.
Yeah.
So let's do that really quickly. And so a couple of things I want to talk about that are happening either this week or before. On Friday, this Friday, February 26th, we're going to have our first Let's Learn .NET event. So this is going to be a very beginner-friendly, free live event where we're going to learn about cool things about .NET. And I think the goal is to have these once a month. So there's going to be one this month in February. There's going to be another one in March, and so on and so forth. And this month, we're going to be talking about web APIs. So if you're unfamiliar with web APIs, you've never really built one before, or maybe you've never even built one with .NET before, this will be a really good, session for you to check out. It's about 2 hours long. It'll be on .NET Live TV and also Microsoft Learn TV, and also here on YouTube as well. It's going to be in all the places. So definitely make sure you RSVP and check out that one. Also happening this week, February 25th. Man, there's a lot of .NET happening this week. February 25th, .NET Conf focus on Windows. So we're going to be talking about, all the things that you could do from the desktop developer perspective. So you think about UWP, you think about WPF, you think about, WinForms and these types of things, right? We're going to have a .NET Focus event on that. That's going to be live. That's going to be in all the places too. So definitely want y'all to come through and check that out as well. And the last link that I want to share with everyone, since we're talking about Dapr today, I thought it was only fitting that we talk about the Dapr for .NET ebook. It's also freely available. And if you want to know where you can find it, if you head over to .NET/architecture, there's tons of free ebooks that cover a wide range of topics from gRPC to cloud native and Kubernetes things and ASP.NET Core things. And now with the release of Dapr 1.0, this is our latest ebook that's available for all of you to try out and let us know what you think about it. So there you go. Right? Did you have anything to do with this book?
Yeah, I actually reviewed the code samples. Sander, who's somebody I know pretty well, is one of the authors. I think I probably know all the authors, but
nice.
We had a lot of back and forth and discussion about Dapr in the last couple of months, and I helped review the code samples for that.
Yeah, for sure. So again, definitely hope folks go ahead and check those out. I'll go ahead and share these links in the chat too in a second. But I just want to make sure everyone got a chance to saw these. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to unshare my screen because I'm not the star of the show today. Ryan, you are. And so I'm going to kind of let you take us into the world of Dapper and .NET.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let us know what are all the things we need to know about.
Cool. Well, thanks. Let me know when I'm live here.
Yeah, your screen is up right now.
Okay. So I promise there aren't too many slides. People always ask. I always say people always ask anyway. So if you are going to ask, I'll forgive you. My presentation materials are all online in the Git repo. I usually push them about a half an hour after I'm done presenting. So there's now a 2021 folder there, and you can find my presentation materials from community stand-up, which I did recently about Dapper, as well as from this show in a little bit. And you can find me on Twitter if you want. So we're talking about Dapper today. And what Dapper really is a runtime for microservices. And it's about this idea of, well, we could turn the communications between your services. We could turn the communications that you have maybe with a database or some external service, and we could make those part of a distributed application runtime. And so that's really what Dapper provides, is this distributed, portable, event-driven runtime that's going to help you build distributed applications and microservices that can work in different networking environments or with different sort of services you want to talk to, data sources you want to consume. So when we think about what's hard about building microservices today, there's a lot of stuff that's hard, but I want to focus on a couple problems that I think Dapper has an interesting solution to, which is, well, we probably need to support a lot of different integration points. So you're building some kind of cloud service today. Maybe you need to talk to Event Grid, or you need to talk to blob storage. Or you need to talk to Twilio or SendGrid to send email. Like, there's a lot of different kinds of things that you might need to integrate with to build real production systems. And the result of that is that you get coupling in your code. So you have to go find the SDK for this service. You have to adopt that SDK into your code, and you end up with something that's maybe not testable, maybe it doesn't have good tracing, maybe the SDK is not very good, or just doesn't have an SDK for .NET, in which case you'd be kind of out of luck. And you have a lot of different targets to support, or a lot of different features that you want to support across these different kinds of integrations. So you care about tracing, you probably care about configurability, you probably care about secret management, and all of these things sort of like leave a scar on your beautiful code when you adopt some SDK or some third-party package to talk to this one-off, other service that you have to talk to. If those things aren't done really well and they don't fit well in your application, then it's just not going to feel good. And like, I think we've all had the experience of trying to use something and being like, this integration piece is half-baked, or it doesn't quite do what I want, and feeling limited by that. So how Dapper solves this problem is by providing you with a bunch of different common building blocks that you can access through an HTTP API or a gRPC API that handle a bunch of different microservices concerns. So if you think about all of these boxes here as being sort of like classes of functionality, right? Pub sub for message queues, state management for caches or key value stores, service to service invocation for communication between your services, and then bindings and triggers for like those external sorts of services. Like, those are sort of how we think about it as building blocks. And they're these like general abstractions that different things that you need to talk to or different tasks you need to do fit into those categories. And then because this is built with an HTTP and a gRPC API, it's accessible from pretty much any language. So I'm the maintainer for the Dapr .NET SDK, along with a couple other folks that help contribute to it. It's an open source project. And we talk to Dapr over an HTTP API or a gRPC API, depending on the task. This makes it really easy for us and for you to write microservices that interop with each other in all these different languages and use the same set of primitives and the same sort of set of toolkits to talk to those things. So we have these API, we have this sort of common core of these building blocks. We have an HTTP API and a gRPC API on top of that. And then we have SDKs that make it really easy for you to do that in any language. And then what it looks like is the integration with your Twilio, the integration with your SendGrid or your Redis cache or whatever it is you want to talk to runs in this Sidecar runtime. So it's not part of your application's code anymore. It's part of an external process that sits next to your application and you communicate with. So go ahead. Did you have a question, Cecil?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question real quick because I kind of just wanted to, because you said a lot of stuff and I want to make sure that I frame it properly.
Yeah.
So out of the box, Dapr is really just like a set of packaged conventions, right? Or package features that I could choose to use all or a little bit of them, right? So if I
Yeah, that's
wanted to
right.
use service discovery or state management, I could use those. Or if I wanted to use observability and secrets, I could use those. Or if I wanted to use all of them together for in whatever combination that makes sense for my app, like I could use those. But essentially, it just kind of abstracts that feature for me, right? So like if I wanted to do pub sub, I don't really need to care that I'm talking to Service Bus or RabbitMQ or ActiveMQ, right? I could just talk to Dapper and Dapper will figure it out for me and then do the right thing.
Yeah, that's right. So like I think the insight is if you look at this slide and you look at like all the different things in it, these big headings here are like the type of building block, and then the items in it are like what are the things that we integrate with. So you could talk to 18 different state stores. You could talk to 11 different pub subs or 8 different secret stores. And the code you write in the application and the way you interact with it in Dapper is the same. So it's kind of this insight of like, well, let's take the approach that like a service mesh uses, but let's start applying that to other things. So can we talk to a secret store without directly talking to the secret store, for instance? Can we make it somebody else's problem how to authenticate with that secret store, what protocol to use to actually retrieve the values, what that wire format is. Let's not make that the application's problem. Let's make that somebody else's problem. And then how you would interact with these secret stores, depending on what you're doing, is the same no matter what. So one of the ways that this comes up that I think is really cool and accelerates your productivity a lot is, let's say that you have to interact with something that doesn't have a good like local development equivalent. Let's say that you need to use Azure Event Hub, right? I happen to know that there's no good like local emulator for Azure Event Hub. Well, you could substitute in RabbitMQ and run that in a container really easily. Like, let's say that in production, you're storing data in Cosmos DB or Azure SQL Server, but in local development, you're just going to do like a really lightweight Redis container. So we have all these different kinds of integrations, and for the most part, they're pretty substitutable for each other in terms of what they provide and what they enable you to do. And then you choose, the thing that you actually want to use based on its merits.
Right, right. And so we got a quick question that's coming in
Yeah.
from YouTube, and this one's from Anthony Lopez. Anthony's asking, is it like the .NET Basecast libraries for Azure development?
I think that's actually a really great way to think about it. Is there's the realization that, or maybe like a sort of interfaces and implementations, right? There's the realization that all these kinds of things fit into categories, and we can create uniform interfaces over those categories that work for most of what you need to accomplish the vast majority of the time. So we can abstract over differences between different databases or secret stores. We can abstract over differences in message queues, those kind of things, and then give you a really nice API and experience to program against it, regardless of what the implementation is.
Right. So I guess then from a developer perspective, I don't have to take dependencies on, or I won't have a bunch of like NuGet packages for all of these very specific implementations.
That's right.
But I could just, either use the HTTP API or have a Dapper package.
Yeah,
right?
that's absolutely right. The other thing I would going back to the question that was asked, the other thing that I would say is it's not just for Azure, right? Like there's a bunch of different things here that are popular open source projects that you can run on your own or maybe use different hosted services for. There's integrations here for AWS and for GCP features. Like a lot of the work that's been done to build these components has been contributed by people. And I would actually say the vast majority of these have been contributed by users of Dapper or the companies that own those services, either saying, I want to use S3, so I'm going to contribute a binding for it and then use it, or people who own those services saying, I want this to have a good experience in Dapper, so I'm going to contribute it and maintain it. So this list is pretty big. The vast majority of these were built by community or people outside the core team, and this list is growing all the time. Donovan Brown joined our team pretty recently. Some of you folks might know who Donovan is, and he built a MySQL binding in his or a MySQL state store in his first week, which is pretty cool.
And then those bindings are written in Go, right?
The bindings are written in Go. So the core runtime of Dapper is Go, and all of these integrations are written in Go. One of the benefits of the approach here is that the actual like perf sensitive, security sensitive, kind of tricky code is written once and maintained once for everybody who's using Dapper, regardless of your language. So the actual job that somebody like me as an SDK maintainer is more focused on like, how do I provide a good programming experience on this than things like, how do I handle secrets, or, what's the highest performance way to use this technology?
Right. That makes sense.
Cool.
All right, another question really quick from Felipe. So Felipe is asking, are we going to see how you would do these drop-in replacements for local versus cloud development? So I'm guessing he's asking if you have demos.
He's asking. So we are going to see a demo. I'm not going to be deploying anything today, but I will talk to it, right? And I think when you see the demo, it'll make it clear. I think the one thing I want to give away is like, the difference between, let's take PubSub as an example and say I want to listen to messages from a message queue, right? The way that would work in practice is I describe what message queue I want to talk to with configuration. And so nowhere in my application code does it say I'm talking to Service Bus, I'm talking to Event Hub, I'm talking to RabbitMQ. That's a deployment time decision, and it's just configuration. So for the vast majority of use cases, if you're using Dapper and you're using one of these building blocks, it's a configuration change to adopt another service. Now you can punch through the abstraction. There are ways to punch through the abstraction. Let's say I need to configure some kind of RabbitMQ service, or some kind of RabbitMQ specific setting. There are ways to punch through that abstraction and interact with that directly. We have this feature called metadata, but the vast majority of cases you probably don't care. Is it Redis streams? Is it Kafka? Is it GCP PubSub? You're going to handle it the same way in your code.
Got it. Cool. Sounds good. All right.
Cool.
All right. I'll let you keep going.
So I want to do an example. There's just going to be a couple diagrams, and I promise we'll try to get to code as quickly as we can. So I just want to do a couple diagrams and make sure the sort of idea of a sidecar sinks in, because it's one of those things that's easy to take for granted. If you've played around with Kubernetes, if you've played around with service meshes, you probably heard of a sidecar before. If you haven't played around with those technologies, this might be new. No big deal. It's the Homer Simpson approach to handling security, handling service discovery, whatever cross-cutting concern you want. And when I say the Homer Simpson approach, I mean, can't someone else do it? The famous episode where Homer becomes the garbage commissioner. I need to know where my other service is to talk to it. I need to manage authentication. I need to get secrets from the secret store. Well, can't someone else do it, right? And so taking this functionality and moving it out of your applications process into a separate process. So an example of service invocation might look like this. Your app is the Python app, and it wants to invoke the Node app. It's going to craft a special URL that can route that to the Node app. And then that's going to go through a handshake between two different Dapper sidecars to end up at that Node app. Now, that's what you're doing in this case. So you're calling a server on another process. That server is calling another server in another process, and then that server is calling into your Node app. The really cool thing about this is, well, let's think about what you're not doing, right? You don't need to know the IP address of that other service. You don't need to know the host name of that other service. You're just using a logical name, in this case, Node app. So we call that concept service discovery. You're getting encryption between the sidecars. So when you do this kind of thing, you get encryption going between the Dapper sidecars, and you're getting tracing. So Dapper can do tracing on its own. And if you're using .NET, you probably want to do some tracing on your own, and .NET makes that easy. If you're using other frameworks, like you're using Python or Node, this is actually huge. It's really, we kind of have it easy in the .NET world. And then the other thing that you're getting here is policy. So Dapper itself has configuration for its routing system. You can deploy Dapper in a way that says, I want to explicitly authorize this service to talk to this service. Or you can deploy middleware that do things like OAuth or rate limiting or different kinds of retry policies and things between services. And I expect that list of policies to grow over time. And the cool thing is, none of that complexity is in the app. It's all things that you just don't have to worry about. And again, because you're letting somebody else do it, it's going through this other process. And to you, you don't really care how it gets there. You just know that it's going to get there.
So I guess the only question then I would ask you is, since I'm going through a third party for communication, is there any additional overhead or latency or performance things I should be concerned about?
There's a really small amount of overhead here, and I think we're talking on the order of a couple milliseconds, like single-digit milliseconds. We've done comparisons with service meshes, like Linkerd and like Istio, and the amount of overhead that Dapr adds for these cases is really competitive with them. I'm not going to quote numbers in case they're wrong, but really competitive and better in some cases than what service meshes do for this. The thing that I would say about it, and most folks are surprised when they hear about this, is if you have this sort of like allergic reaction to the idea that there's proxies between you, realize that a lot of the times in cloud deployment environments, when you think you're talking directly to something, you are actually talking to a proxy. And so in a lot of cases, like in Kubernetes, for instance, are you talking to a service? Well, there's a proxy involved. A lot of these cases, you do really have a proxy in front of you all the time. And so it's not really too different from the use cases that you're already in production. You just might not quite realize that yet.
Got it. Cool.
So service invocation is just one of the building blocks, but I think that this is a good like level setting example. Everybody knows how to invoke something else. They know what that means and what that feels like. And so this gets you used to this idea of a sidecar, being there and doing some work for you. So let's explode the example a little bit, right? So now it's a bigger diagram and it's got more of these different kinds of building blocks on it. And the same principle applies, right? When you want to interact with a state store, when you want to interact with PubSub, when you want to interact with a secret store, the same approach applies. So it all goes to the sidecar. So you can authenticate your request to and from the sidecar. The sidecar is the thing that's going to hold the credentials and know how to talk to the state store, know how to talk to the PubSub, know how to talk to the secret store, and do it on your behalf. So all of those building blocks and all of those integration points are really implemented in somebody else's process, and you're just going to use it like a remote control to do what you want, and it's going to talk with you and from you and to you over HTTP or gRPC. And then what I would recommend using our excellent SDK, which I work on, to make that really nice to program against.
Got it.
So again, just talking about PubSub, like on the publishing side, you send a message to a sidecar, you include the data that you want. That's going to go into a Redis or a NATS or GCP PubSub or AWS SQS or whatever you're using. And then on the subscribe side, there are two things that are going to happen here. First of all, Dapr is going to ask your app, what topics are you interested in, so you know what to subscribe to. And then second of all, when that message does come through, Dapr is going to send that to your app with a post. So you actually get PubSub over HTTP. You don't have to wire up something that listens to a message queue, pulls for messages, and executes a list. It just ends up being HTTP for you. And so this is what I mean when we talk about replacing one technology with another. Maybe you're using Redis for development and you're using Service Bus in deployment in Azure or SQS in deployment in AWS. Like, your code literally just sees an HTTP post with the data, and the difference between what service you're using to back that is an implementation detail or a configuration setting. It's not something your app needs to really know about. The other thing about this that I think is super, super cool about it is because PubSub is delivered over HTTP in ASP.NET Core, well, you can integration test that the same way you would test anything, right? Like, you can write integration tests that mimic easily what Dapr does over PubSub, and you don't have to do crazy like heroics in your code to be able to integration test something that we would normally think of as a production scenario.
Right. And it looks like we have a lot of questions here, man. People
Okay.
really want to ask you about Dapr.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go up because I know there was a few that I may have missed. Let's go with. All right, so Stefan, and all these are coming in from YouTube right now. So he's asking, should Dapr route incoming requests like an API gateway, or primarily is it used for communication between microservices?
So I think, so if I'm understanding the question was about, does Dapr behave like an API gateway? I think the question would be there. Dapr has the ability to do some of the things that an API gateway could do. It has the ability to do rate limiting as well as to do some kind of like auth capabilities coming in from the internet. What I would say is that API gateways are really a pretty specialized technology when you think about understanding the schema of your APIs, as well as doing transformations on the data. Like some API gateways, I think pretty much any API gateway worth its salt probably has the ability built in to like transform the payload of your data as it comes in, right? Let's take the old format and turn it into the new format. And then that way we don't have to maintain both of them in the app. Let's let the API gateway handle it. There's nothing in Dapr that has features like that. There's nothing in Dapr that has this sort of granular, like, let's transform the payload, let's represent Swagger, those kind of things. That's not to say that we wouldn't think about it. The other thing that I would say is if you're using something like Azure API Management, Azure API Management has a really good set of integrations with Dapr where you can like turn API gateway requests into PubSub, turn them into service invocation. You can basically map API gateway requests coming into your API gateway into different primitives that talk with Dapr. So if you wanted to make like some crazy asynchronous PubSub API, that capability exists and that's already like live.
Okay. And then this next question coming also from YouTube from Kizoku. It's a similar question, but a little bit different. And this person's asking, how does it integrate with service message like Istio or Linkerd?
Yeah. So you can use, the thing is, you can use service meshes with Dapr. And we've done a bunch of demos and there's good documentation about this. So if you like service meshes and you want all of your traffic to go through the service mesh for service invocation, you can do that. If you want all of your traffic to go through a service mesh and through Dapr, you can also do that. If you want to use a service mesh for all your service invocation traffic and use Dapr for other things like accessing my secret store or accessing my database or talking to some binding, you can absolutely do that. So again, like going back to this list right here, like Dapr is sort of this menu of different things that it can do. There's nothing stopping you from choosing what you want from this menu and making the choices that make sense for your scenario. So I think there's actually a ton of different combinations in this space that make sense depending on what you want to get out of it.
Got it. Okay. All right. We're gonna pause on questions for now. I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, let's get to some demos and some code, and then I think we'll have a bunch of more questions that will hopefully I can answer a lot of the questions just by doing some demos. So let's talk about how this works. So typically interacting with Dapr, I'm going to show this. I'm going to speak to this slide, and then we're not going to do any of this because there's a better way. If I wanted to run Dapr, Dapr comes with its own CLI, and the Dapr CLI is pretty useful. It can get you started with like a Redis running locally and a Zipkin running locally, so you can have a good dev environment. The way that this works is you do Dapr run, you pass some information about how to identify your app, and then you say how to run the app, basically. So Dapr run app ID my app is basically saying, give this app the logical name my app, talk to me over HTTP, use protocol 3000, and by the way, your configuration is stored in that folder. And then, oh, by the way, do a .NET run. So that's a really long command. There's a lot there, but it sort of all stacks up with, hey, Dapr, start my app this way, is kind of how to think about it.
And one question I wanted to ask you too, because I know in the previous docs, we've seen commands like these, and this is for folks that may have used Dapr before. There's like Dapr and Dapr D.
Yeah.
We've seen folks use, Dapr D. I think it's just Dapr D and like, similar configuration settings. And we've seen folks use Dapr. Like, so what's the difference between the usage of those two commands?
So Dapr, here's how I would think about them. Dapr D, and the D stands for daemon, which is sort of an old, Linux, Unix convention of like a long running server process. Dapr D is the sidecar. So when you look at this picture and there's these guys with this cute little hat on them, those are the sidecars. That's Dapr D. Okay. Dapr CLI, so Dapr without the D, is like the developer CLI. So how do you launch the sidecar and your app? Well, Dapr Run does that. So Dapr Run is more of the like developer surface area, whereas Dapr D is like a little bit more of a detail of how the system works. So you can run Dapr D directly. The use cases where I've seen people run Dapr D directly are when they are writing a script or something like that, and they really want control over like what ports does something listen on, those kind of things. When we get to the Tai demo, I think this will make a little bit more sense. because I'll show you how it all fits together.
Sure.
The other
Yeah,
thing
I'm
that
asking too because I've done demos with Dapper D, but I've done that when I'm using like something like Docker Compose, right? And
yeah.
I'll use that command versus just the regular Dapper
Yeah,
command.
exactly. So like if you want to launch the runtime yourself and you don't want anything in the way, that's kind of what Dapr D is. If you want to run the CLI as a developer to like run a command, that's what Dapr is. I think the other thing you'll see is that Dapr command has more developer focused stuff on it, like the ability to send a pub sub message from the CLI, whereas like that doesn't exist in Dapr D because it's just the runtime.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then on the right side, there's a Kubernetes example. So if you're in Kubernetes, the way that things work is you add Dapr to your Kubernetes cluster. Kubernetes is kind of the easiest way to run Dapr right now. You add these annotations to your pod, basically same information. And then the Kubernetes operator for Dapr will do all the work. So you don't actually have to know how to run Dapr in a container. You don't actually have to know how to use Dapr D. The Kubernetes operator for Dapr will take care of that for you, and you don't have to worry about it.
Cool.
So that's the intro. I want to as quickly as possible start speaking directly to the .NET developers. So let's get rid of PowerPoint and never come back.
Yeah.
I don't think I made any changes. I don't think I made any changes. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show a couple of things. So first of all, if you want to play with Dapr after this meeting, watch the rest of the talk, but you're ready to play with Dapr. You want to come to these Dapr getting started instructions and follow them. So first step would be to install the Dapr CLI. So we've got convenient setup instructions here for different OSs. You can also grab the binaries yourself and do whatever you want. This is going to put the Dapr CLI on your path. So you can see here's the Dapr CLI. And again, answering that question, I'm just going to keep answering it. Like these are all the commands that are here on the Dapr CLI. So like triggering a service invocation, listing the running instances, getting logs, like these are all things that are developer focused, like for your troubleshooting. The next thing that you want to do after you do that is initialize Dapr. So this kind of says what it's going to do, but basically this will download the runtime. So there's a CLI and there's a runtime, and then there's the SDK for the different languages. Dapr initialize or Dapr and NET will take care of all that for you, as well as it'll get you started with a local running Redis in Docker and a local running Zipkin instance. Now there is a slim option if you don't want those things. I'm not sure where it's listed on this page, but I'm sure it's somewhere. There's a slim option if you don't want Redis and Zipkin running, but those are the two of the things that are really easy to work with locally for playing with Dapr. So I'm just going to highlight that. And then let's look at some examples. I'll clear this out because we're not going to look at that. Not yet anyway. So I want to introduce Tai. And I think most folks have seen Tai before. Hopefully you have. If you're a .NET developer and you're building cloud services or you're building microservices, and you've struggled with how difficult it can be to do local development on those kinds of services, I think Tai and Dapr together are like a life-changing combo. So you can find the Tai repo here. This is a public experiment from .NET. It's basically a microservices developer tool. There's this handsome man right here who's me. I was involved with this project at the early days and I still chat with those guys all the time. But this is a great project that you should check out. I think you're having somebody on like next week, or I don't know when you're doing that, Cecil. I was just talking to Justin today, who's coming on with you to talk about Tai, right?
Yeah, we're gonna do a Tai episode. We're gonna record it tomorrow, but it'll be published probably in like a week or so.
So I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'm not going to tell you everything about it, but look forward to talking to Justin and I think Amy as well about Tai. And then I'm going to delete this because that's a spoiler, and we'll get to that in a sec. So I'm now introducing the sort of project set that we're going to use for this demo. I've got a server application, which is like a web API backend kind of thing. I've got a front end, which is a Blazor server, and we're running like the world's lamest bank here, by the way. And then I've got an audit service that's going to do some business stuff. Who cares? So I've got these three microservices, and I need these three to be able to run together and sort of talk to each other. And this would be kind of annoying if you wanted to run all these things. Visual Studio has a way to do this. VS Code kind of doesn't really have a way to do it. You could use something like Docker Compose, but then you have to go write a bunch of Docker files and get started with Docker super early. And it's basically Tai to the rescue. Tai is designed to solve this problem for you of how do I make microservices development really, really easily. I'm going to close some of the things that we don't need here. So close more of the things that we don't need. So I'm here in my folder. I've got my applications and everything in here, and I want to get started with Tai. Well, the best way to do that, I could do a Tai run, which will run in these 3 projects. But the other thing that I want to do, because I want to add some dependencies to this, is I'm going to do a Tai init. And so doing a Tai init is going to understand my 3 projects. It's going to read the solution and understand my 3 projects. And then it's going to spit out a Tai.yaml. And this is basically just going to tell Tai, hey, these are the projects to run. And it detects this based on whether or not they're ASP.NET projects. So if I did Tai run now at the CLI, what it would do is it would just run these 3 projects because it knows that they're ASP.NET Core projects. Tai knows about .NET. But we said that we're doing Dapr, right? We want to do a little bit more than that. So I'm going to jump over here to my little cheat sheet, and I'm going to add something. So I just added Redis to this. We're going to use Redis as a state store in this example because Redis is really easy to run locally. And it's pretty beneficial for doing those kinds of things. And Redis can also act as both a state store and a pub sub, which is really handy for development. So I've got Redis here. And then the cool thing about this, a lot of people, when they look at Tai, they see like Redis here, and they assume that Tai must have some knowledge of Redis or knows specific details about Redis and how to run it. And it's really kind of backwards. Like Redis is just really easy to run in a container. So it seems like it has to be built in, right? Like this has to be cheating, but it's not. This is really just running the Redis container and saying, hey, Redis is going to listen on this port by default. The other thing that I want to do here is I'm going to add Dapr. And Tai has really good integration with Dapr. And in fact, I know this because every time we change something in Dapr during the 1.0 development cycle, if we broke something, we would hear from Tai users like immediately. The Tai team would hear from Dapr users immediately. So I'm going to add the Dapr extension, which is extensibility for Tai, and we'll sort of like program Tai to do some different things and understand a little bit more about my application. And then the other thing that I'm doing here is, in addition to saying, hey, I'm doing Dapr, I'm giving it a path to a list of components, and I'm giving it a config. So a config you can sort of think about as the configuration for how does Dapr work, and then the components are like, what is Dapr going to talk to? So I'm going to go ahead and peel back the covers a little bit on this. I'm not going to show audit store because it has a real credential, but I'll show you a similar example in the future. So here's my config. So this is the configuration for Dapr, and it's basically just saying, hey, Dapr, I want you to do tracing, and I want you to do this zipkin tracing to this address. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. And then, hey, Dapr, I want you to do pub sub. So this is what the format looks like for these different kinds of things that Dapr can talk to. And they're generally of the structure of component, and then what is the type. So this is a pub sub Redis. It could be a pub sub GCP queue, could be whatever it is that you're using. And then whatever the credential information that you need to talk to it goes in here. Now, a lot of people are ready to be like, oh, that's a password. Like, you can't do that. And the thing is, Dapr also has support for getting these values from things like environment variables or secrets. So you don't have to put them in these hard-coded files that you check into your repo. You can get them from external credential sources. That's what we'd actually recommend that you do. But for demo purposes, like I don't even have a password on this Redis because it's just running locally. And then my pub sub again looks pretty similar. Or my state store looks pretty similar. It's a state store using Redis. So that's all pretty cool. So does that make sense? Are we getting any questions about that?
Yeah, that makes sense. The first question I'd probably want to ask you is, how would I know how to configure this stuff? Like, I'm guessing if you go to docs, there should be some structure to what these YAML files look like, because .NET developers really love YAML, right?
Yeah, well, I actually think the opposite. I think .NET developers typically hate YAML, but these YAML files aren't evil. I think YAML, when you have an embedded DSL, like a templating language, now that's evil. If you're just setting properties, is pretty okay. Pretty okay. That's my personal opinion. So if you head over to the Dapr docs, we've got this lovely docs site that my friend Aaron put together. The really great thing about this is we've got good docs for all of these things. What are all the settings that the component exposes, and how do you configure them? How do you use it? So like I said, I'm not going to show you my output binding, but my output binding is for blob storage, and it looks like this, right? I created an Azure storage account, and I put all these things in here. Likewise, if we wanted to come over to secret stores, So inside of here, I go to the list of supported secret stores. I can see their status. Is it alpha quality? Is it beta quality? Or is it recommended for GA? I can come down, or I clicked on secret stores. I can come down to Key Vault and I can see here's all the information that I need to configure that. As well as some of these will have like, here's a link to the Azure, not this one, but I think it's this one. One of these. Yeah, here it is. This will tell you, okay, this is how you go create this on Azure. This is how you go create these things on GCP or AWS or whatever it is you're using. So like we were talking about Redis as a state store. Here's the list of state stores and what features they have. Here's Redis. This looks a lot like the configuration that I just showed you. So what I like to do with these is I copy paste this and then I just edit the stuff that I don't want. I remove the stuff I don't want and I edit the things I need to change. The other thing
you mentioned earlier is that there's so many different components, and then there's some that the Dapper team created and maintains, and then also some community ones as well. So I'm guessing whoever created the thing, right? Like we should be able to look at their GitHub or their documentation and then just pull the configuration out. And now we're just talking about replacing values, right? Inside that YAML file.
Yeah. So the big thing here is like, you look at this list, right? And you can see what's the status and quality of these things. So like, is it GA? Is it recommended for production use? Is it something that's alpha, meaning somebody's used this? The cool thing that I probably don't have time to talk about in a lot of detail, the core team's role in this is actually to help define what are the conformance tests for a component. So how should a component behave in order to meet the expectations that people are going to have in it, and then building a set of tests for that so that you know that all these things are quality and they behave consistently. That work is happening like right now, which is why you'll see a lot of these things are alpha state. It's cool work that some of my friends are involved in where it's like, okay, let's go write the test for this component. Okay, that generated 5 bugs. You need to fix these 5 bugs to get this to like beta status. So anyway, that's a view into this. And again, like what we talked about before with these things being replaceable, like I could be using blob storage for this demo. And the thing that would change is I would change the configuration file. So I don't change my app code for things like state stores and pub subs. If I want to talk with something different, I just replace it with another file with a different configuration talking to a different thing, and I'm good to go.
Right. And so to that point, that we are getting some more questions about like local versus production development, right?
Yeah.
And Felipe here on YouTube is asking, is this where we'll be able to differentiate between local and production pub sub implementations? I'm guessing you could, like you showed here, like there was a Redis one, not this one, but there was the other one. And then I could just swap it for another thing, but I'd have to change the configuration file, right?
That's exactly the idea. And so I would think about this like for instance, one of the things that you can do, like here's my, I'll show it to you and then I'll say, here it is. Here's my tai.yaml, right? What you probably would want to do is you probably would want like these things for development, especially if they don't reference any secrets in them. Like whatever's for your development, like you can just check it in with your code, right? So have these files shared, have a dev setup that's paired, maybe use like a dev container, and like your whole team can just party on that, right? Because if it's all local, then there's no shared state. And Dapr is going to respect this components path and whatever you pass in here, right? So if Felipe wants to have his own config, right? Hopefully I'm spelling your name right, but like you get the idea, right? Or this could be an absolute path and could point to your user directory or whatever you want. So both the Dapr CLI and tai.yaml allow you to set the components path, and then it's going to look for in there things with a name that matches. So it's all just logical names. So if this name matches what you expect in production, congratulations, you just overrode the config for development.
Right. So then to that point then now, what if I had more than one state store configured, or what if I had more than one pub sub configured?
Yep. So you can absolutely do that. And I think this will become clear when we look at the code. You will need to put this name in your code. So this is a logical name. It probably doesn't do us a ton of service that I called it pub sub. Like maybe let's call it like bank transactions or something like that, right?
Sure.
Like maybe the best practice here, we're inventing these on the fly, but maybe the best practice here is to give this some kind of name that reflects your business use case rather than what kind of thing it is, right? It's Pokemon naming. Just say what it is. So like maybe this should be bank transactions or, secret data or something like that. Something that is memorable, that is going to make sense to you when it shows up in your code rather than pub sub. I think the thing is that most of the time, we mostly need one of these things. So they do show up with names like pub sub or state store. But the idea is that when you do a pub sub operation or when you talk to a state store, you provide the name of the thing that you're talking to. And so the Dapper can look that up and you can have multiple of those things. In the very early days of Dapper, you could only have one. A lot of people told us that they needed more than one.
Got it. Okay.
Cool. So then I'm also not quite done with Tai.yaml because we will do some tracing as part of this demo. And I mentioned here that this is the URL for Zipkin. If you've ever used Zipkin before, this is what a Zipkin URL looks like. Somebody's got to listen on this port so that we can do our tracing, and nobody signed up to do that right now. So Tai also has really good built-in support for tracing. And so I'm going to add that. That's another extension. And this is cool, unique .NET thing. So Tai knows how to do this. It's probably going to come to other places in .NET before too long, but .NET knows how, or infrastructure in Tai knows how to collect traces, distributed traces from your application without you changing any code. So when you add this extension here, this is saying to Tai, hey, I want you to collect traces from all my applications that are in this Tai.yaml, and then I want you to run Zipkin in a container and send traces to it. So I'm actually going to show that. Maybe not the Zipkin part, but I'll show you what Tai run does right now. We're still on Tai at this point, but Tai is awesome. I could talk about it for hours.
Nice.
So when I do a Tai.run, you're going to see a whole bunch of spam here, and it's great. Some really smart people figured out that you need to see all this output. So this is going to go off and run a bunch of stuff, and it is, what did I do? Did I hit Control-C? Oh, I had an error. I have an error. This is a real live demo fail.
Do you have Tai running in another window or in a back?
I don't. You know what it is? It's a real live demo fail. I was cleaning up some of this code and I removed references that I wasn't using anymore, and I didn't remove all of them.
Got it.
Yeah, so let me go to my other startup files and make sure that they're all gone. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, I was wondering what it was. I know sometimes like Visual Studio usually has like a click remove all unused references. Someone needs to make like a VS Code extension.
I would love that. I would love that for VS Code. That would be awesome. So hopefully this is, see, all that output was important. I told you it was important, and now it's important because we failed. I failed. So what Tai will do is it's going to start everything, and it's orchestrating these three applications. And then it got buried under the spam, but basically it started Zipkin at localhost 9411, in case you want to get the 411, and it started the Tai dashboard here at port 8000. So the Tai dashboard is sort of like, here's everything that I did. Here's everything that's going on. Here's a view into everything. And so you can see that there's a ton of stuff here, right? I'll just name it. So here's my three applications. Because we know about ASP.NET, we know how to inject ports into these things and have them show up on the dashboard. Here's Redis. I asked for Redis running in a container. Here's placement, which is a Dapper implementation detail kind of service. Is for actors. We're not using actors in this demo, but you should feel comfortable and happy that this is there. And then here are my three Dapper sidecars. So you can see Dapper auditor or bank auditor.dapper, bank front end Dapper, bank server Dapper. These are my Dapr D processes. So we talked about Dapr D earlier. This is the output of running Dapr D, and Tai will orchestrate starting all your applications and starting a Dapr D process for each of them. And so if there were a problem with like the configuration of one of your bindings, you would come here and you could see it in the logs for this Dapr D process. The other thing is if there is a problem in the configuration of like your Redis or your PubSub, you would probably see these guys restarting because they would be unhappy. And then the last thing we got is we asked for Zipkin, we got Zipkin. So with that one command, I've got a Redis, I've got a Zipkin, I've got all these other things running. The other thing that I will say that hopefully makes sense now, and we've done this, when we looked at the Dapper getting started, we saw that Dapper, when you do an init, it runs a Dapper Redis and a Dapper Zipkin runs a Zipkin and a Redis for you to kind of get started. I think as .NET developers, this is actually a little bit of a better way to just use Tai. So if you are using Tai, what I do is this is the wrong window, but I do Docker PS, and then normally this would list like the Dapper underscore Redis, Dapper under Zipkin underscore Zipkin. Yep. I do Docker stop on those two. So like Docker stop, Dapper Redis, because I can, rather than just leaving this running, I can use Tai to manage all these things for me. And it's a lot simpler and a lot happier. So that's how I typically do it. But I've got all this is great, right? Like I've got all this stuff running and I just had to write that really simple configuration file.
Right. And I think the time to productivity for me like gets cut so much shorter.
Yeah.
Right? Because now instead of me having to worry about, oh, I got to configure Dapr over here and I got to configure this Kubernetes container situation on the other side, I can just really focus on, well, hey, these are the things that I want. Like I could literally describe it in YAML. Like, give me this.
Yeah.
Right? Tai will just kind of spin up that environment for me locally.
So the cool thing for me is the ability to have, going back to Tai.yaml, the ability to have my applications, my dependencies that are running in containers, and then my configuration for how to talk to those dependencies all live here in a way that I can check into source control with distributed tracing, with like real services like Redis running locally. Tai gives you a great experience, right? You get to do all those things with Tai. What Dapr adds on top of this is, well, we can replace some of those components for production, or we can make it easy to talk to those components without having SDKs in our code, which is pretty cool. So you got this whole dev setup here that you can put in source control as long as it doesn't require like a bunch of crazy credentials and stuff, which I'm pretty excited about.
Cool. Gotcha.
Oh, I got a text from somebody. That's great. That's my boy Javier, who works on Blazor, by the way. Okay, cool. So let's talk through this app. I want to show this app running, and then we'll talk to the code a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to the bank, and let's say it's payday, and I've been remodeling my house, so I've got no money right now.
I know that feeling.
And we shipped Dapr 1.0, so I feel like I deserve a pretty fat paycheck. So I deposit a bunch of money in my account. It updates my balance. Let's say I have to buy coffee or something. I always tip big at the coffee place. Those people are struggling with COVID. So let's buy a couple coffees. And I don't know, I'm feeling hungry today, so let's buy a new car, a really expensive car. So I've got this little banking application. I can keep track of my account. I can deposit and withdraw money. It is stateful. It is reflecting those changes here. You might notice that there's very little business logic here. I can withdraw like unlimited amounts of money as long as I don't overflow a decimal, and the bank does not care. They trust you. So when you tell them I'm depositing this money or I'm withdrawing this money, they trust you that you know what's best, and you deserve it. So that's our bank. It's really simple. This front end application is a .NET Blazor front end application. And let's maybe, if everybody understands, the code sample, let's start looking at the code and talking through it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, no questions so far, so we should be good.
Okay, and nobody has questions about banking. That's great because I'm not an expert on it. So again, this is a really simple Blazor server application. I hit a really interesting issue with distributed tracing that we are talking about this on this issue. So if you happen to find distributed tracing interesting and you happen to find Blazor server interesting and you've run into problems using distributed tracing with Blazor and having a good experience, go comment on this issue, because I'm sure that we would love opinions from people who have tried to do this before. Right. But anyway, I'm not going to talk through the Blazor code. I think that's a different .NET show. But basically, trust me that this is the UI you saw. And then what I'm doing here is when the page loads, I'm going to look up your account info. So I get your account info based on your username when you log into the page. And I'm just using HTTP client here. I'm using HTTP client to talk to another microservice. And then when you do a deposit, I create a transaction, or I update the transaction. I send that as JSON to my other service, again, using HTTP client. And then that guy responds to me with an updated snapshot of the account, and I just read that back as JSON using these lovely new .NET 5 extension methods on HTTP client. Withdraw looks almost the same. The difference is it's a withdraw instead of a deposit. I think you get the idea. So we have some very, very simple REST API kinds of interactions happening here, talking to my backend service. And this all looks like code that I'm sure we've written a bunch of times and we've seen a bunch of times. And that can be pretty cool, I think. Let's now talk about the server. And I promise we will get to enhancing this code and talking about Dapr here very soon. So let's hop over to my server. And again, this is an ASP.NET API controller. And what I'm doing here is I'm constructor injecting logger, and I'm constructor injecting the Dapr client. And you can think of the Dapr client as like the point of entry for basically everything on the SDK. There's one object that you need to interact with pretty much anything. So Dapr client, I'm using this here when the front end calls get and says, hey, look up the account information for this person. Well, I'm going to get that info from the state store. So get state entry async is going to give me like a little token object for the state. I could also do get state and pass the account, which is going to give me, so I'm using the username as the key in the state store, and that's going to give me back the account name. And so how to think about state store, I'm introducing it for the first time with code, but sort of how to think about state store is a key value store. You might use Redis for this today. You might have heard of something like etcd or other kind of key value stores where I want to store some structured like JSON data, and I expect a lot of people to party on that data. So that data is going to change rapidly. I want to keep it in memory. I want to keep it around. I want to have access to it. I don't have to do complicated querying or like OLTP kind of work on it. It's not like a SQL database. It's more like a Redis kind of thing where it's like, I just want access to the simple data kind of quickly. And so in terms of the feature set with something like a state store, it's light on things like the ability to write complicated queries, but it's more heavy on things like transactionality or the ability to do concurrency control. Right. So I could make get state entry calls or save state calls that have different concurrency behaviors. I could do transactional operations across multiple keys at the same time. That's how to think about a little bit like a state store. So there's still plenty of good use cases out there for like traditional databases. Your use case might still be for traditional databases, but if you've ever approached one of these problems where you really want something like Redis, that's kind of what state store is going after with Dapr.
Got it. And that kind of goes into a question someone asked me today on Twitter actually about Dapr. And the question was, I'm paraphrasing it because I don't have it in front of me right now, but the question was, if I had a database, right, like a querying thing, right, and not a key value store, is the thought that I would use Dapr to replace my database with this thing, or would I still have to would I have to circumvent Dapr and talk directly to the database and then go through Dapr when I want to talk to some of these other components?
Sure. So I mean, the answer to, like all good questions, the answer is it depends. I would say the thing is, if your emphasis is on querying, like if you designed a schema of 5 tables and relationships and you want to be able to query and join and page and filter, like a relational database is the right tool for that. And I don't think that the state store is a replacement for the relational database. Yep. So you probably want to continue to do that. You might get a lot of value out of, depending on your scenario, you might get a lot of value out of using Dapr as a secret store to store your connection string or something like that. But I don't think if you are doing SQL-like operations, I don't think that the state store is going to be an upgrade for you, if that makes sense. Like it's going to be it's probably going to leave you with some head scratching questions, and you'll probably go back to the SQL database if you try it. What I will say about it is there has been discussion and proposals around adding some querying-like features to the state store. So right now you can do things like list the keys, you can get all the keys, you can get multiple keys at a time with a transaction. There has been discussion about adding like a small query language for things like filtering, paging, limiting, those kind of things. Yeah. Kind of like the OData, if people are familiar with the queryable extensions, like the filtering, paging, sorting kind of thing. There has been some discussion and proposals around doing that for Dapr in the future. But you should really think about, like, is a SQL database really the tool you want? Like, I think for a lot of people, the answer is yes. And if a SQL database is the tool you want, this isn't trying to be a replacement for that.
Right, right. So, and the way I kind of look at it too, with Dapper, you kind of have to use the pieces in a way that makes sense, right? Like it's not forcing you to use all the components and be like, this is the only way to build your application, but more so it's trying to take some of those well-defined building blocks and make those concerns easier for you to get started with and implement inside of your microservices.
Yep. A couple other things that we can do here, by the way, and I'm not using them in this demo, but I just want to highlight them because I think they're great. Like we have the from route attribute, we also have from state. If I can type it right, we also have some from state. And so if you want to, instead of doing this, you can sort of model bind things directly from state. So I will say I want to do from state, and I could put in the store name. I'm getting some lag on typing here while I'm sharing, and I could put in the key name, or if I wanted to look up a specific key, or I could have this key be driven by routing. So like the typical use case you would do something like this, and it's actually going to use the route data to look up that value, or look up the value of username from here, and then use that as the key to do the actual lookup in the state store. So if I wanted to, I could put account here and model bind it this way and make that something that's passed in, which I think is really cool because it's really testable. Like you don't even have to mess with like, how do I mock the state client? Which, by the way, this is an abstract class, so you can mock everything. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. People say, why isn't it an interface? It's not an interface because it's a class. You can mock classes. So if you do run into problems, let me know. But a lot of folks have been curious about that. This is designed for you to mock. And in a lot of cases, if you use this model binding feature set, you end up not needing to do that either, which becomes really, really easy and plays super nicely with MVC model binding.
Right.
So we can bind state store entries directly to model binding, which I think is pretty cool. Here, I'm just getting a state entry. If there's nothing there, so if it's null, means it wasn't found, I'll create a new account with a zero balance and return that. When somebody deposits something, I'm going to get the state. If I didn't get anything, I'll open a new account for them. And then we'll come back to this later. We're going to improve this code a little bit later, just creating a little record of the transaction history. And then I'm going to save it in the state. So the cool thing that I'm doing is I'm getting a state entry here, which exposes these methods like save state. So state entry is a class that Dapr provides, and you can think about like, here's your data object, plus here's some operations on it. And so you can do state dot try delete, try save, delete, save, all those kind of things. So you think about this like retrieving the state and remembering where it came from in case you want to pass that into some business layer and have it do operations later. And then likewise, my withdraw operation is pretty similar. So I've just got the transaction and it's a minus instead of a plus because we're doing a withdraw. So hopefully that all makes sense. The only Dapr piece that I'm using right now is I'm using the state storage. So that's the only Dapr piece that I'm using right now. I want to show the startup code for this real quick because that'll probably be the next question. How did I get a Dapr client? I am adding MVC controllers, and then I'm adding Dapr to MVC controllers. So add Dapr on add controllers will add the model binding support for you. If you're using MVC, this is the way to go. If you're not using MVC, the other way to go is to say add Dapr client. And if you say add Dapr client, that's going to add the Dapr client as a singleton to DI, and then you can just access it from DI. If you do need to configure settings, you can pass in a delegate here to configure it, but chances are you won't need to configure anything, especially if you're just getting started.
Right.
So that's kind of how I'd recommend fitting all this stuff together is if you need the Dapr client in your controller, inject it via DI in the constructor, add it, register it. If you're using MVC, do it this way. If you're not using MVC, do it that other way. That'll give you the integration for what you're using. And then other than that, nothing's different here. This is just a bog standard ASP.NET app.
Cool. So then and again, one of the main benefits of this is that I only really have to depend on Dapr, right?
Yeah.
I don't have a add RabbitMQ, add MongoDB, add service, but add, all the things, right?
That's right. So
Dapr deal with that for me.
So we're starting really small here, and I think you'll see in a couple minutes, like we can scale up the level of what we're doing, and the code that we're writing and the nature of it is not really going to change that much. We've already sort of onboarded with Dapr here. When we add capabilities, it doesn't get more complicated. So let's go back to our front end, and we mentioned that we're just using HTTP client to interact with the backend. And right now we're getting that HTTP client. We're getting the address of the bank server. This is Tai's discovery primitive. We're getting that address of the bank server through service discovery through Tai. We're creating a singleton HTTP client, and we're putting that in the DI container as our HTTP client. Well, how about this? Let's change this to use Dapr service invocation instead of using an HTTP client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out. There we go. So comment that out. And then I am going to add a special HTTP client to DI that's created with this Dapr client invoke HTTP client using bank server as my logical name. And I'm going to add that as a singleton in DI. So I'm asking the Dapr SDK, create me an HTTP client that I can use to talk to this bank server backend. And that's it. I'm done. So
that was easy.
That was easy. So now this code uses Dapr for service invocation, and all of these things are the same. So I still can use HTTP client. I still can use the JSON extensibility on HTTP client and all those kind of things to talk to my other application. And what's going on behind the scenes is the Dapr SDK has built a special HTTP client that will rewrite your URL in such a way that it makes sense to Dapr. So if you think about routing and like sort of how does Dapr know where to route the request, that's what this HTTP client does. It's going to rewrite the request to be something that Dapr server, Dapr Sidecar understands. And then on the other end, inside the bank server, I also don't change any of my code. All these things are in the same URL space as we would say in the business. So I say accounts and then a username here. And I say accounts and then a username here. So all this stuff is the same. The Dapr SDK is turning it into something that Dapr understands, and then Dapr is going to route it for you, and it comes out looking the same way as what you sent on the other side.
Nice.
Which is pretty cool. The other thing that you can do here, and some people prefer this, I think if you're using REST APIs and you know HTTP client, or maybe you're using other libraries that are based on HTTP client like REST Sharp or Floral or Refit. I love Refit. You could do the same thing with Refit. Dapr can, these Dapr special HTTP clients can integrate with all of these things. So you should keep using what you like. If you like designing REST APIs and you really like things like headers and query strings and route parameters, you probably should keep using HTTP client and keep using the same tool set and just treat Dapr as a transport in this case. There is another style and another way of doing things. Dapr supports this style of sort of RPC-based invocation. So if you wanted to say, like, build a really simple RPC-style API where you're just going to give everything like names, you're going to use a pretty flat naming structure for how you talk to things, Dapr Client has got you. So you can use methods here on Dapr Client, like this one, invoke method async, that are going to use Dapr's RPC terminology for how that method invocation works. So I could say bank server, and then I would just give this a name. If you want a flat structure and you want to be simple and you don't really care about REST principles and things like that, Dapr has some conventions built in around how to do that. If you like what you're doing today and you think it's the best way to do development and you love it, I personally fall into that camp. I would push you down the road of using HTTP client and say, that's the way to go.
Awesome.
So
wow.
Let's run this. I've changed this code. Let's run this again and sort of prove that this works. And then I want to show some tracing, and we're going to do like a couple little enhancements here real quick.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I realize we're getting a little bit short on time. So I'm going to restart this. And actually, before we restart it, I'll just go ahead and enhance it now to save some time. So we're creating a record of transaction history. So we want to do some auditing on all the transactions that come in. We want to do that after we save the transaction, and we want to do that asynchronously. So how would I do that? Well, I can use Dapr for PubSub. So I'll just go ahead and cheat a little bit and I'll publish it. So for everything that I'm publishing, for every transaction that I process, I'm going to publish an event. And my PubSub, I'm going to give it the topic name of history. And then this data just gets JSON serialized. So whatever you pass in, you can think about whatever you pass into Dapr client is just going to get JSON serialized. So I'll pass in this transaction history here. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Oops, that's not the right thing. Sorry. Screen sharing slows down my screen, which makes it hard to do stuff.
With everything too. Just be glad you're not using like full-blown Visual Studio.
Yeah, it's making VS Code really sad right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I've got my 2 PubSub events. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening and digest more of the code. So we're going to do a tie run. I'm going to fire off a couple transactions. Then we'll maybe look at some code, and then we'll look at some distributed tracing. Because the cool thing about this is we're getting a lot of nice tracing behavior going on, both from what Tai is going to inject and from what the Dapr sidecars are able to do. So one of the cool things is that like you can think about everything going through Dapr as getting traced. So all of your interactions with external services, all of your bindings, all of your pub subs, all those things have tracing applied to them as well. Dapr just knows how to do that. So let's do some banking again. I didn't make as much money today because I didn't release any software. Let's deposit that. And then let's withdraw. Let's make some big withdrawals to pay for my kitchen remodel. Going really in the negative here. Okay, so there we go. We did some transactions. Let's look at the code. Let me show trace first, and then we'll look at the code to sort of explain it, because I think that this is a really good way to do it. So I've got a bunch of traces here. They're all initiated by the front end, and they have like some different things going on, right? So this one is going to be the get account. And you can see there's a bunch of tracing happening here. So this is the app saying, hey, I'm gonna ask for Ryan's account. These 2 are coming from the Dapr sidecar saying, hey, I'm processing that. This is coming from the bank server application tracing it, saying, hey, I got it, I'm executing this. And then this is coming from Dapr saying, hey, I'm talking to your state store. Okay. Let's look at a couple more, because I think this is going to clue you into some of the new functionality that we're going to talk about. So here's a bigger one, a more complicated one. This one is doing PubSub. So here, when I do a withdraw, it updates my account, goes to the bank server. The bank server is going to get state. It's going to save state. It's going to publish an event to my Redis message queue. That's going to then trigger invoking my bank auditor, which is a service we haven't looked at yet. That's then going to get routed to this /history URL. And then inside of that, we're going to invoke a binding. So we've made a request, done service invocation, saved state, published an event, received an event, and then invoked a binding. And then I'll explain this code in just a second. But what this binding is doing is you can see that this is going to audit store. And it's going to go to blob storage in Azure, basically taking the transaction history and uploading it somewhere. So if we come over here, it's unfortunately going to be base 64 encoded. But if we come over here and look at my containers, I've got a real container here, and I've got all my transactions from all the testing that I've been doing, getting ready for this demo. So let's look at that code and let's see how that works when you're doing this in Dapr. And remember, I've already configured my blob storage here. I'm just not going to show you because it's got a real credential in it. We've already looked at that. So here's my bank audit service. Inside of here, I'm using endpoint routing here, and I'm just using like route to code. So I'm using routing to handle these PubSub requests. I could use MVC for this if I wanted to, but I wanted to show something different because I got MVC in the other demo. So I just write a normal endpoint. This is going to handle /history. It's going to get the HTTP context. I'm reading the body as JSON using these lovely new methods that were added in .NET5. And then if the transaction is over a certain amount, like say somebody's spending more than $200 in one transaction, I'm going to add that to the audit log. So I create a binding request. This is a Dapr type. This is a little bit of a detail to blob storage. I have to base 64 encode it to get that to work. And then I tell the Dapr client to invoke that binding. And that's it. Like, this is how I interact with blob storage in this application, how I upload a file. I just create the content, I configure the binding, these names you'll see in our like configuration for this binding, and then I just make a call through the SDK and it handles all that stuff for me. And then the other thing I'm doing is, since I processed the message, I make sure to return a 200 status code. If, for instance, I failed here, like I returned a 500, Dapr would retry the request. Or if I returned a 400 and said the data was invalid, Dapr would mark that pub sub message as like, okay, this is a bad message, it can't be read. So Dapr is going to speak HTTP to talk to you to do pub sub messaging, and it has a protocol around these things like status codes. Now, the way that this gets wired up as pub sub is with this with topic attribute. So with topic here on the endpoint convention builder, this is the equivalent of doing topic attribute on a controller action and basically saying, hey, call this in response to this pub sub message queue or this pub sub component and this topic name. And that's how that gets wired up. And then there's a little bit of boilerplate that I need for doing pub sub. So I need to add what's called a subscribe handler. This is going to advertise to Dapr what endpoints I'm listening on and what topics I'm listening on so that it can do the wiring. And then I'm adding a cloud events middleware. So cloud events, you can read about this if you're interested. It's an open standard for how things like messaging or asynchronous events can work in a way that's interoperable across different frameworks. Dapr is on board with that spec, and it's what we use for PubSub. What this middleware will do is it'll take the cloud event and just extract the body. So if you're handling PubSub events or bindings in Dapr and you don't actually care about the envelope that they came in, you just care about the contents, using this middleware makes it really, really easy for you to do things like MVC model binding or just reading from the body as JSON. Nice. So that's the sort of complete picture here. Do we have time for one other thing?
Yeah, I think we do. We can knock one more thing out real quick.
Okay.
You don't have any more questions, so yeah, go ahead.
Let's do one other thing real quick. Let's do something slightly more advanced with the bank controller. Now, let's say I were really concerned about the UI experience, and I wanted to make sure that if somebody, like let's say somebody posted a transaction, but their balance was already out of date, and we process that transaction after the fact, that may not be a great experience. And so how could I get so the UI and the backend are going to collaborate on making sure that we don't process transactions concurrently, that we updating the user's balance based on the value that they saw when they looked at the page. Right. So one of the ways that we would want to do that, or we could do that, is with optimistic concurrency. And that's a pattern where you return a token and say, hey, here's like a hash value or a checksum or a key. Here's something that identifies the version of the state that you saw, so that they can pass it back to you and you can only operate on that state if it makes sense. So if you've seen ETAG values or similar things in the past, that's basically what we're going to do here. And so most Dapr state stores include ETAGs, and I know that Redis does. It will give you like a snapshot based on the value. So what we're going to do is we can do this. We can say response.headers, and we'll just add an ETAG. And we'll set the ETAG based on state.ETAG. So when you get a state entry, as opposed to just retrieving an account directly, it's also going to give you the ETAG value so that you could do optimistic concurrency control. So we can return this ETAG value in the header, in the response to our caller, so that they can give it back to us in the future. And then over here, we're basically just going to check the ETAG. So we get a state entry, and we're going to do something like this. So var ETAG is going to equal to request headers ETAG header. Somebody's going to yell that there is a constant for this. I'm sure you're right. I'm sure there is a constant for ETAG.
Yeah, there probably is.
Some people love constants. I don't care personally. So there's the ETAG value we got from the request. It may or may not be present. It might be null. That's okay. And then we're just going to do a comparison. So if state.value or if state.ETAG is not equal to ETAG, we're going to return conflict and say, hey, I can't process this based on the ETAG that you told me. The value in the account has already changed since you looked at it. Optimistic concurrency control. And then down here, we're going to do something a little bit different here. Instead of doing a save state, we're going to do a try save state. So if await try save state. So this is, again, another feature of that class, but you can access this just through Dapr client itself. And we'll say, if you fail to save, we're also going to return a conflict here.
Right. Okay.
So we can do things with the state stores like transactional operations or optimistic concurrency control and say, hey, so based on this snapshot, I want to do this. If you can't do that based on that snapshot, then tell me I failed and I'll update the balance and try again. So this would be how we would like say, oh, and then we also need to return the e-tag here, but I'll let you figure that out. So this would be how we would say, okay, I know the value I want to process. Let me confirm that I'm really processing that value. And then let me transactionally save. We would do the same thing with withdrawal that we did for deposit. Let me transactionally save that value and save it only if this condition is true. And if not, let's tell people we failed. And then we would update the UI to have this similar kind of logic there and flow these e-tags through. So those are some of the kinds of things that you can do with the state store that become a little bit more interesting when you think about like data that changes a lot or you need to keep in synchronization.
Nice.
So cool. So that's what I wanted to show. Do we have any questions?
This is awesome. I feel like there's just so much stuff, and I feel it's one of those scenarios where we really have to like do it to really like have it sink in.
Yeah.
We did have some questions. So we had a few folks ask if the code for the project that you're showing, the code that is on GitHub anywhere.
Yeah. So the code, you can find this code under my repo. So under my name, I'll just bring back. I'm actually not going to bring back my slides because I don't want to bring up things that y'all aren't supposed to see. But anyway, I'll just type it because I can type. So github.com, not that. Let's make it a comment. github.com, Ryan Nowak, my GitHub username, presentations. And then these are organized by year. So 2021. So there's already a folder there for the community stand-up. I did some similar demos in the community stand-up with the same app. The code's a little bit different now because I've updated to 1.0. I will upload the code from this demo in like 20 minutes.
Okay, got it. Nice. So there you go, folks. So we just learned all about building applications with Dapper. And I don't know, for me, I think it makes things a lot easier as a person that's, I'm not into all like the Istio Linkerd stuff. Like there's a lot of stuff that we need to do to like get microservices ready to get ready to be deployed. And so if as a developer, I could just say, hey, give me a queue, right? Like give me like observability, give me service discovery, and I could just talk to it over HTTP and not really have to worry about the implementation so much. That for me is a huge win in terms of my productivity.
Yeah. I think the other thing too is like you make the choice of what you're using a configuration time setting. So you can swap them out in different environments, or you could like say, not ever have to handle secrets in your code again, which is kind of cool. Not have to worry about configuration settings lining up inside your code or how to design a scheme to store them and retrieve them and so on. So those are some of the little things that are kind of like annoying that are in your way when you're just trying to make something cool. It's like you have to stop and figure out, connection strings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think Dapper goes a long way in helping alleviate that pain.
Awesome. Well, hey, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on, man. Like every time you come on the show, whether it's like the pre-records of these, like you always come with so much cool information.
Awesome.
For folks that are watching, if there's anywhere that you'd want to point them, obviously but like where do we want folks to go to really, demos, Gitter channels, YouTubes, all that stuff?
So the best two things I would give you, the best place if you want to get help or you want to ask questions or you want to see examples. First of all, there are two things, right? There's the Dapr.NET SDK repo. So I'll point you at this. So Dapr.NET SDK. I hang out here. I work on this. I merged a PR from somebody this morning. You can talk to me here. You can log issues here. You can ask questions here. Documentation here is being improved. We would love help filling out documentation. Yeah. The best way to view the documentation is on the Dapr docs site. So I think it's docs.dapr.io. The best way to view documentation is on the Dapr docs site. The SDKs, like say .NET is going to show up here real soon. Aaron and I are working on that. So like you can see the Python docs are linked here and have a nice visualization here. Mm-hmm. .NET is going to show up here real soon, I promise. The other thing, if you want to ask questions, you want to talk to people, Discord is the best place.
Okay.
So I hang out here. It's going to open the Discord. I didn't want that. Go to the Dapr repo. you can find a link to the Discord. The other thing that I would say here is we have a community call. So we do a roughly bi-weekly community call that you can dial into and you can ask questions. This is more like if you want to get news, if you want to follow up what's going on, if you want to hear about latest developments with Dapper, if you want to get more involved. That's kind of what the community call is for. So a lot of the people who work on Dapper will be on the community call like week in, week out, answering your questions and talking about what's going on with the project.
Nice. And I think there was one just yesterday. There was a community call yesterday. Yeah. And that talked all about like, V1 being released and tons of great stuff that's going on in the community. So definitely folks should go over there and check that stuff out.
Awesome.
Cool. All right, man. Well, hey, thank you again, Ryan. Really appreciate it. Thank all of you for watching. We'll be back again next week. Next week actually is going to be the first stream of March, and we're going to be walking into Microservice March. So we kind of jumped the gun a little bit and had Ryan come on to talk about microservices. But all month in March on the .NET on .NET Live TV, we're going to be talking about microservices. So definitely come over, check it out. And if you have any questions about projects that you're working on or things that you want to see, like definitely go ahead and let us know.
Awesome.
All right, man. Well, hey, it was great seeing you all. Take care.
Always good to see you again. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.